Chapter 11 in your text is going to be about the legal and ethical issues in research. Research takes place in a historical environment and places ethics in perspective. It has been said that those who fail to study history are condemned to repeat it. Ethics is actually the disciplined study of morality, and morality should ask the question, what should one's behavior and character be? Over the next few slides, we're going to be looking at some of the most awful research that has occurred in our past, one of them being the Nazi experiments that took place during World War II. During World War II, a number of German physicians conducted painful and often deadly experiments on thousands of concentration camp prisoners without their consent. Unethical medical experimentation carried out by the Third Reich can actually be divided into three categories. The first category consists of experiments aimed at facilitating the survival of Axis military personnel. In Dachau, physicians from the German Air Force and from the German Experimental Institution for Aviation conducted high-altitude experiments using low-pressure chambers to determine the maximum altitude from which crews of damaged aircraft could parachute to safety. Scientists there carried out so-called freezing experiments using prisoners to find an effective treatment for hypothermia. They also used prisoners to test various methods of making seawater drinkable. The second category of experimentation aimed at developing and testing pharmaceuticals and treatment methods for injuries and illnesses which German military and occupation personnel encountered in the field. At the German concentration camps, including Dachau, scientists tested immunization compounds for the prevention and treatment of contagious diseases, including such ones as malaria, typhus, TB, yellow fever, and infectious hepatitis. Prisoners were also subjected to phosgene and mustard gas in order to test possible antidotes. The third category of medical experimentation sought to advance the racial and ideological tenets of Nazi worldview. The most famous were the experiments of Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz that he conducted on twins. Other gruesome experiments meant to further Nazi racial goals were a series of sterilization experiments undertaken primarily at Auschwitz. There, scientists tested a sterilization of Jews, Roma, and other groups that Nazi leaders considered to be racially or genetically undesirable. This is a picture of those high-altitude experiments that were used to investigate the limits of human endurance and existence at extremely high altitudes. The victims were placed in low-pressure chambers, and thereafter the simulated altitude was raised. Many victims died as a result of these experiences, and others suffered grave injury, torture, and ill treatment. With high-altitude experiments, the death occurred by the body's inability to tolerate decreases in oxygen changes in the blood-brain barrier, which led to vasogenic edema and pulmonary edema. These are some of the pictures of the experiments on twins. Part of the exam that Mengele did consisted of forcing tubes through these little children's noses into their lungs. Then they were ventilated with a gas which caused them to cough so severely that they had to be restrained. The sputum from the lungs was collected for examination. They were also taken into a room with tables and hot water and were made to sit in the water until they were ready to pass out from the heat. They were then strapped to a table, and their hair was plucked out trying to save the hair root. The twins also received several 2-liter enemas. Now, I don't know how many of you have given a soap suds enema in clinical, but in my experience, an adult can barely tolerate 700 cc's of fluid, and these poor little kids got 2 liters put into their intestinal tract. This caused them an awful lot of pain. The boys, on different days, were strapped over a bench and their rectums were hyperdistended, after which they received an extensive lower gastric intestinal examination. This procedure was performed without any anesthesia. The young men were crying so loud that Mengele ordered them to be gagged. The next day they received a painful and humiliating urological exam. In this examination, tissue samples were taken from the kidneys, prostate, and testicles. Several semen samples were forcibly taken over 2 days. After all the living data was taken from the twins, they were killed by a single injection of chloroform into the heart. And some of the most bizarre stuff is care was taken to ensure that the twins died at the same time. The twins were then dissected, and the organs were sent to research centers. The freezing and hypothermia experiments were conducted for that Nazi high command. The freezing experiments were divided into 2 parts. First, it was done to establish how long it would take to lower the body temperature to death, and second, how to best resuscitate the frozen victims. The 2 main methods used to freeze the victim were to put the person in an icy vat of water or put the victim outside naked in sub-zero temperatures. The icy vat method proved to be the fastest way to drop the body temperature. The selections were made of young healthy Jews or Russians. They were usually stripped naked and prepared for the experiment. An insulated probe, which measured the drop in body temperature, was inserted into the rectum. The probe was held in place by an expandable metal ring, which adjusted to open inside the rectum to hold the probe firmly in place. The victim was then placed in the vat of cold water and started to freeze. It was learned that most victims lost consciousness and died when the body temperature dropped to 25 degrees centigrade. The second way to freeze a victim was to strap them to a stretcher and place them outside naked in the extreme winters of Auschwitz, and that was a very natural place for this experiment. Well, if you remember your history, there were the Nuremberg trials that took place after the World War II, and out of that came the Nuremburg Code. This is for all types of research and was developed in 1949. Now, I don't want you to memorize these dates. I just want you to keep them in mind as I talk a little bit more about the atrocities committed in the name of research. There are 10 requirements for ethical research that comes out of the Nuremberg Code. One is the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This means that the person involved should have the legal capacity to give consent and should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without any element of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior forms of constraint or coercion, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehensions of the research process as to enable them to understand and make a good decision. The experiment should also be done that it should yield fruitful results for the good of society. The experimentation should be so designed and based on the results of animal experimentation and a knowledge of the natural history of the disease or other problems under study that the anticipated results will justify the performance of the experiment. The experiment should be so conducted as to avoid all unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. And no experiment under any circumstances should be conducted if there's an a priori reason to believe that death or disabling injury will occur. The degree of risk to be taken should never exceed that determined by humanitarian importance of the problem to be solved by experiment. Proper preparation should be made and adequate facilities provided to protect the experimental subject against even remote possibilities of injury, disability, or death. And the research should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. The human subject needs to be at liberty to bring the experiment to an end if he has reached the physical or mental state where continuation of the experiment seemed to him to be impossible. And finally, the scientist in charge must be prepared to terminate the experiment at any stage if he has probable cause to believe, in the exercise of good faith, superior skill, and careful judgment, that a continuation of the experiment is likely to result in injury, disability, or death to any of the subjects. There's another document, the Declaration of Helsinki, that was created in 1964 that was concerned with medical research. And this was a declaration that was adopted by the World Health Organization, and the major focus was the differentiation between therapeutic and non-therapeutic research. Therapeutic research may have beneficial results for the participant in the research, whereas non-therapeutic research, the benefit may be for future patients. And it has some of the same principles as the Nuremburg Code. Number one, it is the duty of the physician in medical research to protect the health, privacy, and dignity of the human subject. It must be based on a thorough knowledge of scientific literature and other sources of information, including adequate lab and animal experimentation. Medical research must be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons under the supervision of a competent medical person. And ethical review committees must be involved to assess the risks and benefits of the research study. And we're going to learn about those later in this lecture, that are called institutional review boards. Finally, each potential subject must be adequately informed of the aims, methods, sources of funding, any possible conflicts of interest, institutional affiliations of the researcher, the anticipated benefits and potential risks of the study, and any discomfort it may entail. And if a person declines to be in the study, it should not preclude any medical treatment. Well, now that we have these two documents, the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, you would think that research conducted after this time would be ethical. However, we're going to find there are 3 cases in the United States that occurred during these time periods when these documents were being created that were unethical. One was the Tuskegee syphilis study, the second was the Willowbrook study, and the third was the Jewish chronic disease hospital study, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of those. Now, during the development of the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki, the Tuskegee study was ongoing in the United States. In 1914, a Dr. Boaz instituted a study on chronic health problems in the black population. It was to call attention to the prevalence of syphilis in the black population and meant only to present statistical information. In 1929, the study turned into a treatment study because in France, it was found that using arsphenine resulted in a 50% reduction in syphilis cases. The treatment was funded by the Julius Rosenfeld Fund and the Public Health Service. In 1931, subject at St. Andrew's Hospital, which was affiliated with the Tuskegee Institute, thought they were being treated for rheumatism and told they had, quote, bad blood, since the Public Health Service believed that the term bad blood meant syphilis to the black population. Well, as you know, during these years, a big thing occurred, which was the Great Depression. So in 1932, funding for the study was discontinued, and it was at this point that the study turned into the longest non-therapeutic study on humans in history, and was based on an assumption that blacks would suffer more neurologic complications than whites, and it was renamed the Public Health Service Syphilitic Study at Tuskegee. It involved 399 infected men and 201 controls. And most surprising of all, central to this was a black nurse named Eunice Rivers. She rounded up men, followed up at their homes, drove them to appointments, and got consent for autopsies. In effect, she withheld treatment for this and received recognition from the Public Health Service. Special treatments consisted of painful lumbar punctures required to diagnose neurosyphilis, which caused some to be paralyzed and others died from the treatment. In 1933, the Rosenwald funding resumed, and a black MD by the name of William Perry came to the Tuskegee area, and the researchers were worried that if he gave their subjects treatment, it would ruin their experiment. So Nurse Rivers became Dr. Perry's assistant, and she actually prevented the subjects from getting treatment. From 1947 to 1952, the United States Public Health Service established treatment centers for syphilis using penicillin, but decided not to treat the Tuskegee men because the longer the study went on, the better the information they got. They felt that the damage from syphilis was done early, so the men were already past helping. And in 1961, the 12th paper was published, entitled The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis, the 30th Year of Observation. In 1969, there was a conference that was held about the ethics of this study. However, no one had any training in medical ethics, no one was black, and they did not even follow their own rules on ethical research. They felt the subjects would probably not accept treatment and didn't want this publicly known. The story finally broke in 1972. 65 years ago, beginning in 1932, the United States government, through its Public Health Service, committed one of the greatest frauds, injustices, and misrepresentations against 623 African Americans who were citizens of Macon County, Alabama. The men were misled into participating in a study of untreated syphilis, sponsored, financed, and supported by the federal government for over 40 years. They never gave their consent to be involved in the study, nor did they realize that they were part of the study until the story broke in July of 1972. This picture is actually a picture of Eunice Rivers as she went about doing her public health service nursing in the Macon County area. This is actually one of the buses that Eunice Rivers would use to go around and collect her different subjects for the Tuskegee syphilis study. This is the Willowbrook study. And remember, we have both the Nuremburg Code and the Helsinki document stating how research should be conducted. And in the 1950s, the Willowbrook hepatitis studies occurred. Now, I need to give you a little bit of understanding about why people with mental disabilities tended to be put in institutions in the 1950s. In that era, and I'm from around that time period, people who had mental disabilities or physical disabilities at birth, it was suggested, and highly suggested to parents, that those children be institutionalized because the communities in which they lived were not very accepting of those individuals who were different from them. So they created a system of what they called state schools. And the Willowbrook State School was an institution for the mentally disabled on Staten Island, New York. And there was a Dr. Saul Krugman who was director of research at Willowbrook. He knew that many children there would develop hepatitis because of overcrowding and other unsanitary conditions. In fact, many members of the staff developed hepatitis as well. He knew that the virus responsible for hepatitis did not have hosts outside of human beings, and he was persuaded that these conditions justified research on the disease in humans, and he initiated a project at Willowbrook to study gamma globulin injections to determine whether they would protect children from infection. The injections did seem to have a strong positive effect. Dr. Krugman admitted new residents of the school to special quarters and fed them virus samples he had collected from other children. By tracking the virus exposures and the patterns of symptoms that followed, he was led to the conclusion that hepatitis had two strains, A and B. A had a shorter incubation and was highly communicable, whereas B had a longer incubation and was less communicable. When protests arose regarding his exposure of these kids to hepatitis, Dr. Krugman defended his work. He said if he had not infected the children as part of research, they would have developed hepatitis anyway because of the school's communal housing. This research, he said, was akin to an experiment in nature, and no level of improved hygiene would have protected the kids. He noted, too, that he had been given permission from the parents to experiment on their children. It is true that the children were enrolled with parental consent because they got a letter, and the letter said, "Dear blank, we are studying the possibility of preventing epidemics of hepatitis on a new principle. The virus is introduced and gamma globulin later given to some so that either no attack or only a mild attack of hepatitis is expected to follow. This may give the children immunity against this disease for life. We should like to give your child this new form of prevention with a hope that it will afford protection. Permission form is enclosed for your consideration. If you wish to have your child given the benefit of this new preventative, you will so signify by signing the form." Now, the parents were not told the full extent of the study, nor were they told about any of the possible harm that may come to their children. And they were, in fact, being coerced because it was really hard to get students into an institution during those years. So it's just a way that unethical research was being conducted. This is a picture of how those children were communally housed in Willowbrook. Now, once again, here we are, 1963, with a Jewish chronic disease hospital study. In 1963, studies were undertaken at New York City's Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital to develop information on the nature of human transplant rejection process. These studies involve the injection of live cancer cells into patients who are hospitalized with various chronic debilitating diseases. Previous studies had indicated that healthy persons reject cancer cell implants promptly. Patients with widespread cancer also reject transplants. However, rejection is delayed substantially when compared with healthy subjects. The researchers said that consent had been given orally but was not documented. They felt that documentation was unnecessary because it was customary to undertake much more dangerous medical procedures without the use of consent forms. Further, patients were not told that they would receive cancer cells because, in the view of the investigators, this would frighten the patients unnecessarily. Investigators defended this view on the basis that they had good cause to predict that the cancer cells were going to be rejected. Well, there was a national commission that came about from the U.S. government because all these horrendous studies were going on, even though we had the Nuremburg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki. So they developed the Belmont Report in 1974. And within it were the Belmont Principles, which are concerned with the basic rights of all human beings. One is respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And we're going to look at each of these. Respect is treating individuals as autonomous agents and not using people as a means to an end, but allowing people to choose for themselves and giving extra protection to those with limited authority. Self-determination means you cannot use coercion. An example of coercion would be if I asked you to be in a study and I had power over your grades. This actually happened to my son when he was in a psychology class out at Northern Illinois University. They were told that they could not earn an A in that psychology class unless they took part in studies that were going on at the university. And I probably should have gone out there and raised some particular hell, but I didn't. Respect also means that they have a right to privacy, that not everybody should know that they're involved in a study. And they also should have anonymity and confidentiality respected. Now, anonymity means that neither the researcher nor other people know the name of the subject, and that is usually concerned as being a blinded study. Confidentiality means that the researcher knows who the subject is, but others do not. Beneficence is acts of kindness or charity that go beyond duty. Obligations derived from beneficence means do no harm, prevent evil, and promote good. Now, Harm can be physical, psychological, social, or economic. These rights are violated when the researcher knows in advance that harm, death, or disabling injury may occur. Justice means to treat people fairly, which means that everyone must share the burdens and benefits of research. Now, an example is using only people in the so-called charity wards or those of lower socioeconomic classes as subjects in research, while the results of the research may benefit those who are better off. So everybody must share in the burdens of doing research. In applying these principles to research, beneficence means there's a sound research design, competent investigators, and a favorable risk versus benefit ratio. Respect means there's informed consent and respect for privacy, and justice means there's equitable selection of subjects. Now, in order to make sure that all of these rights are protected, from the Belmont Report, institutional review boards were created. These boards, and we have one here at St. Xavier, and I sat on that board for about 7 years. Institutional review boards review research projects and ensure that ethical standards are met in relation to the protection of the rights of subjects. The role of the IRB is to assess for 1, fair recruitment, to evaluate inclusion and exclusion criteria, and we're going to be talking about that later in the course, to determine the investigator-subject relationship to make sure that there's no coercion going on, and establish the role of the IRB in the study. And I'm going to have something to say about that in a minute. The role of the IRB is to basically review the consent forms for autonomy, protection, and risk versus benefit. They review the consent form to see if they're clear and see if they need some additional protection, such as if you were doing an interview with people who had AIDS, you would have in advance set up some kind of psychological help in case a problem arose. They must assess the risk versus benefit of the study, and they assess the consent forms and the process of the study. As far as recruitment goes, the plans and materials to recruit people to be in the study must be reviewed by the IRB, and public service announcements or ads must also be reviewed, such as when I did my study on sacrificing something important, I actually put little blurbs in our church bulletin, and the IRB at Loyola had to look over those little sheets of paper with all my information on it to make sure that the people's rights were being protected. Now, there are several approval categories that the IRB committees can use. One is exempt. It's very low risk. Non-vulnerable people are included. It's not a sensitive study and has very short duration. And then there is an expedited review, in which there's minimal risk, it's non-vulnerable, non-sensitive, and usually one member of the IRB committee can review the research study and then give permission to carry out the research. And then there are studies that require the full board review, such as here at St. Xavier a few years ago. Someone in the chemistry department wanted to do a research study, I believe, using arsenic, And so since it seemed to be there was some potential danger there, the entire board had to look at the research to decide whether or not they would let it go forth. And as far as this full board review goes, all members participate and review any research. All members participate in discussion and make comments, and the decision is rendered by a majority of the assembled quorum, and it must be that no member has a conflict of interest. What I want you to remember about the institutional review boards is that they only examine research studies to determine if they are upholding the basic rights of respect, beneficence, and justice, and looking at risk versus benefits. They do not judge the quality of the study itself. So how do we know whether we are protecting the rights? Well, generally it's done through informed consent. And you should be somewhat familiar with informed consent because it's similar to the informed consent that hospitals use when they're doing procedures on patients. What informed consent is that it's an ongoing process of communication and mutual understanding and shared responsibility for the protection of human subjects. For informed consent, there must be a level of comprehension, and it's not valid unless the subject understands the research protocol. The responsibility for understanding rests with the researcher, who must look at the nature of the population. How old are they? Can they give consent? The type of information that they are giving. The information given to people must be at a 6th grade reading level. To look at the circumstance and the timing. Did you give any analgesics before you were beginning to tell people about your research? And you must look at the language and the culture of the person from which you are getting consent. Special consideration must be taken for vulnerable subjects. These include children. Now, children under age 7, you must get consent from parents or guardians. For children age 7 up until legal age, and that depends on the state you're in, you not only have to get parental consent, but you have to get assent, A-S-S-E-N-T, from the child itself. So you have to get 2 consents. You also have to get guardian consent for mentally disabled persons, and you have to be careful of those who are economically or educationally disadvantaged. All of these people have diminished autonomy. Since you can see, these people mentioned before were vulnerable subjects, and there are also subtle vulnerabilities such as language, culture. If the person is pregnant, you as students are also considered vulnerable subjects. Employees, chemical use, and health status. Anything that can put you in a position where the researcher has more power than you. So the elements of the informed consent consist of the purpose of the research, the expected duration for the subject, the description of procedures, and the identification of any experimental procedures, should there be any in the research. In the consent form, it should also discuss any foreseeable risks or discomfort and how they can be minimized. They should also talk about foreseeable benefits for the subjects or for others, and how can they be maximized, and if there are any alternative procedures or treatments available. Confidentiality in the consent form should also be addressed. Also, any compensation for research-related injury. And if the person has a question, who they can go to get those questions answered. And that the participation is always voluntary. Consents that involved an intervention must take particular attention to talk about any unforeseeable risks, situation where the researcher can terminate the subject's participation, and if there are any additional costs, how they're going to be covered, and any consequences and procedures for the subject's early withdrawal, and there really should be none, and any revelation of new findings. Also in the consent form, payment, total or prorated. As far as payment goes, it really shouldn't be in excess of what the cost would be, since the IRB tends to take a dim look on paying subjects like, let's say, $5,000 to participate in this study because it looks a lot like coercion. Also, you have to know who has access to the records. If they are going to be randomly assigned to a treatment arm or a non-treatment arm of the investigations, and what are the qualifications of the investigator. Now, anonymity and confidentiality, this should be pretty much something that is familiar with you because of the HIPAA privacy rule, but there's also the individually identifiable health information, or the IIHI, that data that are part of a data set, information that is de-identified before a researcher can go into a data bank and pull up different types of data that they might want to be able to use in research. Now, I put this ethics lecture up front in our research course because I really think it's important that you are aware that there are these ethical violations, because you may be asked to take part in research studies, especially if you work at a tertiary institution. And I want you to be aware of what you're dealing with when you're maybe taking part in getting people in the hospital to be part of a scientific study that's going on there, and that you really look at really protecting their rights. And you also must know that just because the Belmont report came about and the IRBs are out there, that unethical studies are still going on in the research community at this time.